Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries. This podcast is a rambling journey through the wonderful world of RPGs from the viewpoint of a long-time GM and player. The music at the start of this podcast was Nightmare by Alexander Nakarada and is used under Creative Commons license. Okay, so this episode I'm joined by Johannes Paavola, and we're going to talk a little bit about the V20 Sabbat game that he's been running, that I'm fortunate enough to be playing in as part of a misbegotten pack of reprobates called Collateral Damage. So, Johannes, what is it that made you want to run a V20 game when you decided to run a game?
Well, as I said in the RPG Day questions that we did some time ago, Vampire was one of my first big loves in RPGs, and V20 is a really handy collection. It's sort of like the best of, or the hits, I suppose, the hits album of the past 20 years of Vampire. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, and I think they polished the material up quite nicely. Obviously, they can't include everything from 20 years of publication. that would be an insane book. Almost as big as Zweihander.
Well, I'm not sure I've seen any role-playing books that are as big as Zweihander, to be honest. But I think it's what Old Man Grognard calls like a coffee table book. Although I didn't think when he used the phrase, he literally meant like a book the size of a coffee table.
Yeah, it's just you just put legs under it and then you're ready to go.
That's
but yeah, for V20, I think it's for the old Masquerade. It's sort of like metaplot agnostic, and they wrote it to be that way. So it's sort of suitable for anything you want to do in the classic Masquerade world, depending on which your preferences are. You don't need to use bits of the metaplot that you don't like. That it's not written and baked in there. So I like it in that it's sort of flexible. It doesn't assume a lot. It just presents a shit ton of information, which is what I'm looking for, because I can make my own decisions on like what I want to include and what not. Indeed.
Now, your V20 Sabbat game is called What Rough Beast. Now, obviously, I recognise the quote that's from, but when you first started running the game, what is it that made you decide to call it that, and what sort of concept and sort of themes did you have envisioned when you first started out?
Well, I do enjoy the poem, though, like often quoted it is, but I quite like it. And I guess it started as an idea of, we're going to play the Sabbat, but we're going to start sort of like street level. So we're not going to be the like high mystics of the sect or whatever. Like we're not going to be the secret assassins and soldiers of the Black Hand. We're just going to be basically nobodies on the street. And I thought that was something that could tie into us basically discovering just what we might turn into as we play, because we started sort of almost like right off the bat when you get embraced, and the Sabbat propaganda hasn't really done the magic yet, so you're kind of like a person still. And I figured that might be something that we discover in play, like how actually monstrous are we going to be. And we've been doing a lot of that. For some characters it's been faster, the development into inhumanity than others, but I thought that was something I wanted to do, and I sort of baked it into the title. And then I had some other plot related ideas that I figured could be sort of like thematic in that they also tie into the title of What Rough Beast. And because we're nearing the end now, I find myself smiling at the fact that I don't actually know like which is going to be the beasts when we reach the end. Like which is it going to be, the humans that we know are in our games and doing whatever they do? Is it going to be the pack or some of the members there, or is it going to be some of the other Sabbat members or other vampires in the city? And there's a couple of candidates in my mind for the actual Beast, capital B.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've very much enjoyed about the game, as you've said, we've had both we've come across like your stereotypically more monstrous vampires who are further down the path of inhumanity, but also we've got we've got sort of like there's like a sort of small army of like hunters, for want of a better term, out there who are sort of doing fairly like monstrous things given like the equipment they've got. We've also got sort of like the gang members and like Big T, who's like one of the local sort of like gang leaders / like pimps. And one of the things that I quite like about the game is it's not only because I've played in a lot of games where like the theme's supposed to be like monstrousness, but it tends to only be like the vampires who like reflect that. Whereas one of the things I'm enjoying about the What Rough Beast game is that theme seems to be reflected in a lot of the other NPCs, whether they're Cainites or not. And was that like a conscious decision you made at the start?
Oh yeah, definitely. Maybe not in so many words, but I like to in Vampire specifically, and to a lesser degree in World of Darkness. But the most I play is Vampire. So in Vampire, I really like to play with the idea that it's just easier for everyone to be just the worst kind of person you can be, and it gets rewarded, especially in Vampire. If you're the kindred or canine, you get rewarded for being awful, like just the worst. And I like to play with that idea with like everyone in the setting. Of course, you have the ghouls. I know that we haven't done a lot of that with this game specifically because it's the Sabbat, and they are fairly like laissez-faire with their ghouls. Maybe don't really care that much, so we haven't like interacted in like deep ways with the ghouls that we have in the game. But ghouls are one of my favorites for like reflecting the worst parts of the world, because they're sort of still in the mundane world where they sort of represent the failures as far as they can be called. So sort of like the awful qualities of being a person, and then you also like get the vampiric influence on top of that, and you get the worst of both worlds, so to speak. So in that way, I really enjoy ghouls.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the only real ghoul we've got is our pack. Obviously has Trip, who runs like a small pawn shop, which was our original communal haven, although we've moved at least once and probably soon be moving again after the events of last session. So we move around a fair bit. So we've only really got sort of like Trip in terms of like a goal. But I do agree with what you say. I mean, the interesting thing about the goals is they've sort of got, I suppose, like a foot in both worlds. And like you say, they are basically human, but they've got like a couple of the sort of like the vampiric sort of edges, if you want to call them that, to them.
Yeah, and I especially in past games I've run, I really enjoy playing with the idea of really old ghouls, because then you get the creature who is still basically a human, but they've lived as long as vampires, and they've been exposed to all the darkness that comes with that, and it's been happening to them for hundreds of years potentially. And some of my favorite ghouls have been humans who have been exposed to let's say some of the more like dubious clans, such as the Giovanni. So one of my absolute favorites is a Giovanni ghoul who I've sort of hinted that he's probably at least 400 years old and still a human, because he's basically an outsider to the family, so they don't really care. But he's really useful, so they've kept him around for 400 years or so. And he has long since switched to a path of enlightenment. And I quite enjoy like bringing over the like how messed up you get when you are exposed to these mass murderers for such a long time.
Yeah, and I mean, I think as well, obviously, you've got the revenants for the Zimmersi clan, and I think, if I remember correctly, the Giovanni had some sort of Gaul families, although I don't know if they were sort of revenants in terms of the rules, where it's sort of, although they are technically human, as you say, they've been more sort of brought into this vampiric world from an early age, so they're more used to it. But conversely, you see like a lessening of their like human side, because they've sort of more firmly like planted themselves in that vampiric world.
Yeah, there's some Zimmersi ghoul families which are basically all of your like disturbing people from horror movies, such as like The Hills Have Eyes. Basically, like there's a ghoul family which are basically horror movie monster people. They live in the woods alone because they can't interact with normal humans anymore. Like they just don't have the mental capacity to be civilized in any way. They're basically just vampires without actually being vampires, and then like really monstrous ones. Yeah, I think I really would like to play a ghoul game. Now that we're talking about it, like down the line sometime. Like a ghoul or a revenant game would be really fun, I think.
I think that's a nice way of potentially doing like there's often like the talk of like doing a game where it's like a single clan, but quite often you get people going like, oh well, I don't want to play a Tremere, or I don't want to play a Brujah or whatever. I think potentially doing like a ghoul game where you're all the ghouls of like the same vampire, or a revenant game where you've all been sort of raised in the traditions of the same clan, might be a nice way around that. And it's also, like you say, it's a way of like keeping it down at that sort of like that street level you were talking about. So it doesn't matter how powerful you get as a ghoul, any like reasonably respectable like vampire is going to like wipe the floor with you, unless like you're some like 500-year-old ghoul and they're like some like 2-day-old neonate.
Yeah. There's well, I ran this isn't in almost any way related to the V20 game I'm running now, but I ran my face-to-face group through the Giovanni Chronicles some time ago, and well, there's a lot of problems with that chronicle. Let me tell you, if you didn't go through that back in the day.
Yeah, I've played through that. I'm aware there's some serious issues with that chronicle.
But there's a portion of it where you play ghoul for a long time, and I think that's probably the best pre-made vampire. Like it's not really adventure, but like pre-made vampire game concept that they have ever published. I think it's the concepts and ideas in there. Well, it's a ghoul game, so you play ghouls who are probably all serving this like one vampire, and you do that for several decades. And I think that's probably like the best part of the Giovanni Chronicles. Like there's 3 or like 4. Well, there are 4 books altogether, but like in one of them you have this ghoul portion. And spoilers, by the way, for anyone who hasn't like read those 20-year-old books or heard someone bitch about them. The rest is kind of you need to do a lot of heavy lifting, but the ghoul portion almost like runs by itself. And I think it's like this is a hot tip for the listeners. Just get the ghoul portion of the Giovanni Chronicles and just run that as your campaign. Like don't worry about the rest.
I mean, one of the things that I liked the idea of in the Giovanni Chronicles and the Transylvanian Chronicles that I didn't really feel worked is the idea, you're playing different periods of history and you're playing your sort of vampires through history, which I think if you're playing a vampire game, it's almost a shame not to do that in a way, because obviously one of the big things about vampires is they're functionally immortal. So, but in the same way as like it's the whole idea of like D&D and games like that is to play this campaign where you go from like 0 to hero. But like, let's face it, no one ever really tends to end up running a campaign that long. I think Vampire has much the same problem, whereas it's a real shame that you don't get to play from like I'm a neonate in like the Dark Ages or whatever up to like modern day when I'm like some elder and I'm now the person sort of like looking at the neonates in the same way I was looked at. But it's very rare, I think, a campaign actually runs long enough to do that.
Yeah. I think there's definitely, well, as you said, the Giovanni Chronicles and the Transylvania Chronicles as well, they both try to do exactly that. And I think, the Giovanni Chronicles succeed, I think, better in that sort of thing. But I think that's only because the Transylvania Chronicles are just, oh boy, I don't, like, I read through them, and it was rough going. I never touched them back in the day, but like looking at the books now with what we know, and just with our modern eye, it's just not up to par on any level.
Yeah, I mean, I think I struggle with that with a lot of the older vampire books. It's like, well, obviously when I was first playing Vampire, and I'd probably played like maybe 2 other role-playing games beforehand, and I just sort of got the books and I was like, oh, this is how it is, and you just sort of accepted it. Whereas like you say now, having like more experience in playing different games, and obviously like Vampire and D&D like aren't the only games in town anymore, when you sort of look back on these games now, it's like I looked at Transylvania Chronicles, and it was like either two different people like wrote the first bit and the second bit, or like the guy who was writing the first bit like took like a whole like bag of magic mushrooms like just before he wrote the second bit, and then it was just like, oh yeah, aliens in the sewers, and yeah, spoilers again for anyone who's not read this like cackled book, aliens in the sewers and like vicissitude everywhere and stuff like that, and it feels quite disjointed to me when I try and look back at those books now. And I'm not saying that like you couldn't as a GM sort it out, because I think any sort of good GM could take what they want from the books, but certainly compared to some of the campaign books you can get now for sort of more modern games, to coin a phrase, I think they do look a little bit sort of like clumsy and disjointed now, these sort of older books.
Yeah, and well, Transylvania Chronicles particularly, one of the things that really annoyed me, that someone would do this repeatedly in the text of the book. It goes, well, there's this, like, it probably like describes a scene, and somewhere along the text for that scene, or immediately after it, or before it, in the introduction to that chapter, it basically says, well, we came up with these 4 ideas, and when you read them, you realize they're kind of like separate, distinct ideas that don't really necessarily have anything to do with each other. They're just stuff that happens. And then it goes on to say, well, like you make up the holes that we left here. So, and then I'm left here holding the book and going, you've just told me, like, you didn't on purpose, you didn't write your book and you left it full of holes, and then you tell me to do the work of making any sort of sense with this. Otherwise it's just going to be, well, 4 encounters, of which like 2 are built to be just straight out like long swords out and your potent celerity combat fest. In between those, it then tells you like, yeah, you should probably like drop more combat encounters here, and then you get like 1 story encounter at the end, and then fast forward like 200 years, and there's like nothing there for any sort of like coherence or story tempo or like whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly know when I first read that book that, rather like yourself, when it gets to the big bits where it's like, oh, you just make up some shit that goes in here. I was like, I could have done that without the book. Yeah,
without your extremely poorly thought out ideas, which don't really have anything to do with each other.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're not just here to like sort of bash the old World of Darkness, and we do have to remember, I think, that they were sort of published like quite a number of years ago now. So
yeah.
I mean, I think if you look at sort of like the new World of Darkness stuff and like the 20th anniversary stuff, and I'm sure the newer edition of Vampire, although you yourself know more about that than me, I'm sure that like there'll be a lot of lessons learnt when it comes to sort of putting out their books. I mean, obviously there's not the sort of vast array of supplements for like 20th anniversary and V5 at the moment, but I'm hoping at least when they start bringing out the supplements, they'll have sort of like learned some of the lessons from the old books, and they'll have, I mean, that's the only real thing that keeps me sort of interested in like the new version that's coming out, is going to be seeing like whether they have learned these lessons and how it's going to look through sort of like modern eyes, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and definitely like when you look through these, particularly the campaign books, the adventure stuff for Old Vampire, you need to keep in mind that it was a very, very different time, and that's also why the text looks like how it does.
Yeah.
How it constantly talks about advanced, quote unquote, role playing, and how you need to be mature, and all these things that really like speak to me of almost like this branch of the industry being like taking its baby steps. Like you haven't figured out how to even talk to your audience yet. Like you're talking to, at least that's how it like looks like to me, that these writers write their stuff thinking someone who doesn't understand what I'm writing is going to read this, and I need to give them guidance so that they don't get it wrong. And that's how it reads to me a lot of the times with these older books. And like to me, it just looks silly. But of course, that was a different time then. And if I would have like written these as they came out of the press, I would have been a different person looking at them with different information that I now have. But just looking back, it was a very different time and a very different game, I presume.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I mean, we have to remember that obviously nowadays, mature in inverted commas or sort of like darker games, they're fairly sort of 10 a penny. You know, there's lots of different ones out there, but sort of when Vampire and like the other World of Darkness games came out, they were sort of like really the first of these games. So I think they do suffer by the fact they've been imitated so many times over the years. So we're almost at the point now where when you look back at them, they do seem quite old-fashioned and, like I say, a little bit clunky, a little bit sort of behind the times, but they only really seem that way because they've been imitated and sort of improved upon a number of different times over the years. So I'm hoping that V5, and when they do more for the 20th anniversary, if they do, it's going to be them sort of like bringing that full circle and sort of taking lessons from other games in that sort of genre and sort of updating it. And I think we need to face as well the fact that obviously vampires and things like that, they're not quite the sort of the big lore they once were. You know, it's not quite such a sort of niche thing now, and nor's roleplay, to be perfectly honest.
And like the big part of Vampire's origin, of course, was the fact that at least it was seen in certain circles as a sort of a reaction design to the big player in the field, which was D&D. And with the whole like, oh, we're gonna be first of all, we're gonna be in the real world, quote unquote, the world of darkness, and then we're gonna deal with these with dark themes and social themes. Like, it's not just gonna be a combat fest. We're gonna sit down and we're gonna talk, and we're not gonna go off on adventures. We're gonna figure out how to exist with each other and people around. So I think a lot of the weird stuff that like stands out to me, at least, is probably due to a little bit of that. Like, you deliberately pose yourself in the opposite corner of whatever was the thing then, and as a result you use language in a different way. And I think quite a lot of how Vampire has been seen is a bit of a result of that, because I've heard so many stories of people saying, well, I started playing D&D, I did too, and then like when I got a little bit older and they published Vampire, I stopped playing D&D because I was trying to be cool. I got my leather jacket on, I got my sunglasses on, and I'm playing this cool kids game. I'm not with that like dragon bullshit anymore. I'm playing this like dark and teenage angsty game simulator.
Yeah, I mean, I think ironically, one of the things that made a few of the things that made Vampire stand out at the time have sort of led to it suffering in the long run, because as you say, at the time it was like, oh cool, it's in like the modern world as it was then, not in a sort of generic fantasy land. It's dealing with like current themes. But obviously, whereas as times moved on, the fact that sort of D&D was sort of like generic fantasy has stood it in fairly good stead, because it's still generic fantasy even in the modern day, whereas obviously Vampire, that was set in the modern world of the time with those issues, the real world has moved on. So I think when you look back at some of those older books now, the themes maybe don't have as much resonance, because like I say, it was a very different world back then, which is like, again, to keep sort of harping on about the same thing, is something I'm looking forward to sort of seeing in V5, how they folded the current modern world into the game.
Yeah, they I do have the PDF for V5, and they definitely like bring it up to speed. They've scrubbed a lot of the 90s of the game, and they've done a lot of other stuff as well, but we'll do like a separate like V5 review or whatever like down the line.
Yeah, sounds good.
But yeah, like my short form review of V5 bonus content is quite good. I really enjoy the design. I enjoy that they stuck with the storyline, the meta plot. I'm a huge like meta plot hoover for Vampire the Masquerade, and they stuck with the meta plot and they moved it forward as well into new and interesting directions, and they basically made the game fresh in almost all of the areas, which is, I don't think, nothing to sneeze at for a game with as much baggage as Vampire has.
Yeah, I mean, regardless of like how good or not the new version is, it's got to be a fairly daunting task as like game developers to sit down and look at like all the stuff that's been released over the years for the World of Darkness, and then like sort of look at that blank first page before you start writing anything and go, all right, how do we update all this shit to make it relevant for like a modern audience?
Like, where do we start even?
I mean, even just talking about it now, I honestly think if I'd have been faced with the same sort of situation, I'd have had no clue how to actually like start the ball rolling on that. So I mean, regardless of how good or not of a job they've done, I mean, fair play to the designers for just like getting it out first of all.
Yeah, they did the thing.
That's it. And I mean, if you obviously, it's not an easy thing to publish anything. Well, it's easier now than it was perhaps back when Vampire first came out. But sort of doing something that has such a place in the heart of like many different fans of whichever edition, Old or New World of Darkness it is, it's got to sort of like weigh in the back of your mind when you're like, all right, we're effectively like changing a really well-loved property. So it's got to be, it's got to sort of weigh a bit heavily on the shoulders where you're like, oh, obviously we don't want to mess it up, but by the same token, we can't leave it 100% the same because we're trying to update it for the modern audience.
Yeah, I think overall they did a fairly good job with all like keeping parts and bringing new parts in. But yeah, so that was a slight side tangent there.
Indeed.
So our game, What Rough Beast.
Yeah, I was going to ask. Obviously, you chose to run it in LA. What was it that led to you wanting to pick? Was there any reason you picked that specific city? I mean, I know sort of running games in like cities is pretty much the standard for Vampire, because if you were just a vampire on your own in like the middle of the countryside, it wouldn't be very interesting. And where would you get that blood from? But is there any reason you particularly picked LA as like the setting?
I quite like the location for. Well, it's a giant city, right? And that's always fairly easy as far as vampires go. Like you don't get the issues that you do with smaller cities where like, is it like sensible to have any amount of vampires running around? Because like people would notice real quick.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all sort of played in games where like the GM's going to like, oh, we're starting off in like a small town or a village, and they're like, all right, this is the prince, here's like his 10-childer, then you've got representatives of all the other clan, and you're like, are there any real people in this like village? Because like, how have they not noticed that there's like 80 vampires in a village of like 200?
Yeah, and you introduce the Camarilla court, and then you just ask, well, is there any, like, you have constituents at all? You have the prince and a shit ton of whatever, like people that amount to being courtiers, and then just like, do you have any peasants in your neo-feudal system? Like, is anyone living here, or do you just rule this city with no vampires?
Well, that's it. I mean, I think the structure of like the Camarilla doesn't really work once you're below like a certain number of vampires. Because obviously the sort of stereotypical sort of structure where you've got like the prince, the seneschal, the sheriff, the scourge, a primogen for each clan, possibly their seconds, like clan whips, harpies, and all of that. Even if you just put those basics in and you don't have any actual clan members, which obviously would be ridiculous, but for argument's sake, if you don't, you're still looking at about sort of 10, 15 vampires.
Yeah.
So if you're running in like a village, which reasonably could probably only like cover like maybe 6 vampires if you were lucky, the sort of default structure of the game doesn't really work.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons. It's an easy place to set a game because you have the urban infrastructure there, and I quite like the locale as well. Like, you have the sea there, which gives different opportunities. You have the mountains and plenty of like park areas, large like reserve type areas. And I quite enjoy the idea of the climate down there, and because I'm from Finland, so like the sort of climate you have in LA is to me like, ooh, that's nice, that's different. So there's that, and
yeah, I mean, I think one of the handy things about running games in like big American cities. I mean, I've done like a few games in like Boston and like New York and a couple in LA. Is most of the cities tend to have like big sort of park areas, and there's quite a mix of different terrain. So if you want to do like, oh, you're meeting in like a big park and you're meeting with like a gangrel or something like that, you can still do that without it seeming like, oh, I've got to arrange to like travel like 200 miles into the wilderness to like, go and see him. You can still have that sort of going on in the city, but by the same token, if you want to run an adventure that's set amidst like the urban sprawl or like the decaying docklands, you've only got like a hop, skip, and a jump, and you're there.
Yeah, and also I quite enjoy the sort of like the canon material for LA in the world of Vampire the Masquerade, and I think because it is the anarch free state, right? But I sort of like move beyond that. So like this is the post-anarch free state that we're living in, where the free state has pretty much collapsed, and well, at least it's still there, but it's lost almost all of the big pillars that actually made it possible. And then I quite enjoy the video game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodline. So I picked a bunch of the ideas in the tabletop RPG materials for LA, and I picked a bunch of the ideas for Bloodlines, and I sort of like mashed those together, and then included my own as well, and then made this rather like it's easy, right, when you're working from at least some sort of base. So I included like some of the core ideas of what the vampire stuff in LA is like, and just for context. So for our game. And like the World of Darkness in general, the Sabbat has tried to take control of LA for a long time, and they've always got their asses handed to them. So I framed this game as like the latest effort in the long series of failures on the part of the Sabbat to actually do anything in LA. And yeah, so that sort of like served as the springboard for this. Okay, and now you guys can be just like street level nobodies in the Sabbat.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point because I gather in V5, like the Anarchs are sort of much more of a thing. I mean, as you know, I'm like as far from being a fan of the Anarchs as like it's possible to get. I've like gone round the other side and like met them, but I've been talking to a few people and they're saying they've evolved the concept of what the Anarchs are, because my sort of idea of the Anarchs is, and I'll quite happily admit this, is very much set in like sort of second edition like Vampire, whereas it was like, oh, we don't really want to join the Sabbat because they're a bit monstrous, and we don't want to join the Camarilla, so woo, fuck the man.
Yeah, and they just sit around and do nothing.
Yeah, so I know my sort of view of them is like fairly archaic as far as the game goes. But is there anything in the sort of like the newer core book about that you can like divulge about how they've sort of developed the Anarchs a bit?
They're gonna come up with like the next two books from White Wolf at least are probably gonna be the Camarilla book and then the Anarch book. I don't know if that's the order, but anyway. Those two are coming out, and the situation has changed in the V5 timeline in that basically the Camarilla has really started to basically collapse. The Ivory Tower is broken now. The Gangrel already left the Camarilla in the previous materials, but most of the Bruja did as well. So the Camarilla is down to 5 clans, and you'd have a fair share of the Gangrel and the Bruja in the contemporary Anarchs in V5.
I mean, let's face it, the Bruja and the Gangrel were always sort of like almost tailor-made for like the Anarchs, really. Yeah,
and the thing that like propels a lot of this forward, given that this is the situation, is that the Camarilla basically sort of accidentally let regular people know that vampires exist. So now there is a collection of various intelligence agencies and assorted like interested parties who know that something exists that looks like people, but they're not people. And this new so-called, it's called that by the vampires. This is the second Inquisition in the Masquerade world.
Okay.
It's not organized, like these entities aren't really like talking to each other, but there's like the Russian Secret Service knows that something is really fucked up, and so does the American like Central Intelligence Agency, and they've done some stuff, let's say, that really shook up the world for vampires at least. because now they know that vampires don't show up on, let's say, like infrared red. So you just like infrared is very easily available. So you just get yourself some gear and you start scanning people, and eventually you spot what they call blank bodies, and then you go, huh, that's interesting.
That's it. Anyone at room temperature.
Yeah, and so I think it probably started like earlier than that, but at least in like 2008 in the timeline of the new book, a lot of the stuff is getting shaken up pretty well, and most of it is the Camarilla. So they accidentally, due to like, it was inevitable, right? Because you can't mess with people that long and that much as the people do in the Camarilla, especially because they like to interact with people, right? So you can't mess with them without them eventually figuring you out. And people figured a lot of the elders out, and also, surprise, humans can do a lot of computer stuff. So when you do have the Shreknet of the Nosferatu, with the fucking data banks of every vampire location and their havens and whatever.
Yeah.
Someone got into Shreknet and they took the information. And basically, like a huge list of Camarilla, like big players, just got knocked out. Firebombed havens, people like SWAT teams coming in during the day and just killing elders like it's nothing. And so like a lot of the Camarilla structures starts like breaking down because the elders are the structure and they die. So there's that.
Yeah,
and
I think it's quite cool they've actually done that, because I remember sort of back in the earlier editions, and one of the big things when they were saying about the Masquerade, and they were sort of describing how the fact that even though the Sabbat ostensibly are like, oh no, fuck the Masquerade, we're not scared of humans, they did sort of follow their own version of the Masquerade. So like, oh, we're not scared of humans. However, if there's hundreds of them with like tanks and bombs, yeah, that's not so good if they like become aware on a grander scale. So it's actually quite nice that they've sort of like moved it on and gone to like the logical progression that they sort of hinted at earlier on.
Yeah, so that happened, and like different clans, obviously, like I said, the Bruja left, and different clans have suffered in different ways. Of course, a lot of the Ventru elders just fucking died. So there's a lot of new princes. Like they come out with the fact that okay, a lot of people died, so it's basically the Ancilla, the Ancilla, however you want to pronounce that. They are now the new elders, like these people who are like maybe 100, 150 years old, like max. And well, the Tremere got fucked up, so the Inquisition went like, wait a minute, we think like the like ground zero for all this vampire bullshit is in Vienna, where the like big chantry of the Tremere is, and they got drones and they blew the whole fucking thing up.
Well, I mean, let's face it, what's going to make you seem like more dodgy than just being vampires? Or we're not only vampires, we're like blood wizards as well.
Yeah, so basically the Tremere is just decapitated, so that's a thing.
I mean, I think it's interesting to sort of like bring you back to your What Rough Beast game. We've been talking about this new Inquisition. Obviously, in your What Rough Beast game, you have this sort of paramilitary organisation that we've sort of recently blew up bits of and got involved with firefights with, and all manner of like tomfoolery. Now, obviously, since we're still playing the game, I'm not expecting you to give away any like secret plot information. But why did you want to sort of use like this sort of hunter organisation, for want of a better term, in your game? What was it about them that sort of like spoke to you in terms of the game?
I quite like the idea of I'm sort of modeling what we're doing in our game after the Society of Leopold stuff that they have in Vampire. So I'm sort of riffing on that because I find the idea really almost like tragic that there's this one branch that's also excommunicated. It's not anymore in V5 like the Vatican went, oh, maybe you guys were right all along.
Actually, yeah, coming in with your vampire knowledge.
Yeah. So, like, this is before that, obviously, but so I find it quite tragic that there's this group of, like, excommunicated faithful people who are really fucking obsessed with these monsters that only apparently they can see in the world, and they're just extremely committed to this thing that no one believes is true, and they get involved, obviously, with the vampires that they're tracking, and then they get their just desserts, I think. But also, like, there's the fact that they're actually right, like they know that vampires exist, so they get some of the shit right, which I find interesting to play with. I was quite lucky for you originally to pick for your character the weakness of Silver, because I was already like planning on, because I'm going to use these guys, and they get a lot of shit wrong, so they think that Silver is good for vampires, and then you're like, I'm weak to Silver. I'm like, well, you proved them right.
I know when we sort of like broke into like a couple of their safe houses, you were describing how there's lots of like garlic everywhere and like crosses and stuff like that. You know, the sort of stereotypical like Hammer horror sort of like deterrents, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, so I wanted to put them in because I quite enjoy the Society of Leopold as a concept. I don't so much enjoy the superpowered like hunter shtick that they did. So I'm not big into Hunter the Reckoning, was it?
Yeah, Hunter the Reckoning. I mean, I personally, I quite like that, but it was a good game when it existed within its own little bubble, sort of around the whole like time of Judgment, Gehenna, whatever you want to call it. But it didn't really work outside of that little bubble.
Yeah, so like not too much into that flavor, but I quite enjoy it's sort of the proto version of what's called the Second Inquisition in V5 is what I'm playing at right now in our game. Like, these guys are serious, they have access, they have high level contact, they know enough to be dangerous, but they get a lot of shit wrong, but they have the conviction to do something about it, which is a lot in a world which doesn't give a fuck about you if you are a person. And I thought it was probably going to be a little bit different to do the whole like hunter stuff with Sabbat instead of the Camarilla, which is, at least in like my mind, the more common version. So like you're the Camarilla, there's been a masquerade breach, you need to go fix that, and probably there's a hunter somewhere in the mix. And I thought maybe try and see what happens if we do this with the Sabbat. Obviously, like I had the hunters stake your place out, and you guys got like right from under the eye of Sauron, so to speak, because you switched havens just as I was like, well, yeah, they're gonna, like, they figured out you were there because you had some firefights in the vicinity and whatever.
Yeah, we weren't exactly discreet.
Yeah, and there's been people dying and they have eyes on the street, so like they figured you out, like they knew where you were, and then you switched havens, which was like we would have had a different confrontation with these guys if you hadn't switched places. You probably would have like woken up to some C4 or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my slight regret, I mean, obviously I've enjoyed sort of playing a character who's gone on to like a path of enlightenment. I very much enjoy that, but sort of like seeing the hunters in the last session, my only regret is I'd have kind of liked to have held on to my humanity up till that point, because then you've got the whole sort of like, oh well, you know, like that whole sort of like, are we the baddies sort of thing, where all right, they're doing sort of horrible things, but they're ostensibly doing them to like protect people from even worse monsters. So that'd have been cool to kind of play. And whereas obviously being like on the path of feral heart, I'm like, oh, they're threatening the pack, they gotta go.
Yeah, that's one of the that you guys sort of like diverged away from due to not really being interested in going into the place where probably more of these guys are, and you blowing up their entrance as well. So you guys sort of like diverged away from one of the sort of like titular what rough beast moments there, where, well, we still have people on the path of just straight up humanity, and we would have probably had some choice words there with some of the like higher level, like the upper management of the society, but like you say, like you're already beyond that with your character, at least. So, but yeah, like definitely these hunter guys are on my list of, well, they're kind of the baddies as well. Like I don't know if they are the beast yet, but we'll see. We'll see how the next session goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool as well. I know we've touched on this briefly, but it's pretty cool that there aren't really any sort of like clear-cut sort of, yes, these are the shiny goodies, or these are the sort of evil, despicable, like infernal baddies. Because obviously all of the characters have sort of like got their dark sides. I mean, even Matthew's character Lucille, up until last session, I would have said like, yeah, Lucille was like the most humane sort of member of the pack. Yeah. And obviously I'm aware that it was my character trying to go like, oh yeah, just kill those people with like your Shroud of Night. It's grand, just go for it. But obviously all Cainites or Kindred, whatever they want to call themselves, have got this dark side. Hence the beast. So it's quite cool to sort of see that even the most like ostensibly like human characters have a bit of a dark side. I mean, I think the only one who possibly doesn't that we've seen at the minute is Trip, ironically, who's a ghoul.
Yeah.
Because he genuinely just seems to be like a nice guy who's like a bit of a stoner, and he's been ghouled, and we've just gone, carry on running your pawn shop, and occasionally we're going to get you to do shit for us. And he's like, oh yeah, right, whatever.
Yeah, and then just like uses all of his brain power to ignore some of the horrific abuse that's been put upon him, and this shit that he's noticed about you guys that he doesn't want to deal with. So he's doing the whole like, I'm just looking the other way because I'm not getting actively hurt or anything, so I'm just gonna ignore that.
Yeah, it's that whole denial thing, isn't it, where if it's not directly influencing you, you can turn a blind eye to an awful lot of stuff that's going on.
Yeah, you just call up your friend, I don't know, maybe you go over and like play like Call of Duty for a while, and you just forget about the blood stains on your guys' clothes.
That's it. I mean, we did see again another way sort of reflecting that when we had the police turn up at our haven last session, thanks to like a bit of a misstep on behalf of Lucille.
That was an incredible play by Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much like, I mean, fair play to Matthew. I think probably like 80% of like the role play in that session came either directly or indirectly from that. And for anyone who's not familiar with the game and has not heard us sort of laughing about this, basically our Ductus Blythe asked Lucille, who's like ostensibly like the influence sort of like person, the more moves more in human society, to get us some police officers.
Threat has been detected.
Get us some sort of police officers, thinking like, oh, we'll use them as influence, etc. And Lucille actually just ended up calling like a load of police who turned up to our haven with like shotguns and cars and stuff like that, thinking there was something going on there. So, and then we had to sort of work out how we could get away from that, if we could still salvage the situation and stuff like that. But pretty much, I'd say, yeah, pretty like a good 80% of what later happened in the session happened as a result of Lucille's actions.
Yeah, it's wonderful how well Matthew plays into the clueless aspect of his character. The character just doesn't seem to quite grasp a lot of the sort of vampiric aspects of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that's fair. I mean, one of the things I always thought about the La Sombra clan that obviously Lucille belongs to is that they've always seemed like they'd be a better fit for the Camarilla than the Sabbat, because, you know, they're all sort of like, especially the older ones, they're all sort of like influence gathering, using their pawns, stuff like that. Not really the sort of down and dirty like Sabbat like the rest of them. So I think Matthew sort of playing his character that way is very fitting based on his clan, and he's obviously... Lucille was obviously chosen because she moved in society. She was quite well off, you know, she had a bit of influence, etc. Whereas obviously myself and Blythe were just sort of like tonked over the head with a shovel, because they're like, oh, they look a bit rough and ready. Dung, dung, let's bury them and see what happens. Yeah,
and like Blythe is Lucille, Matthew's character, is the only character who actually had any real contact with the vampire who sired her, even though that was very brief as well. But like, at least like she got to talk to him.
Yeah, I mean, obviously myself playing Annie and Dennis playing Blythe, we were sort of like mass embraces, but we didn't know our sire. We started off as pandas / Katif, and had to sort of find our own way from there, which I think sort of accounts for our sort of slightly sort of rough around the edges sort of view of things. You know, we've not got quite the sort of rosy like civilized view of things, because, well, we had to like dig ourselves out of our own graves and then like survive frenzy and stuff like that before we could settle down into being Cainites. Whereas it certainly feels to me that Lucille was maybe like not sort of like handheld through it, but was given a more sort of gentle introduction into being a Cainite.
Yeah, sort of the old school, almost like pre-Sabbat. Like, I choose you, so I'm gonna like you need to be up to my standards. So I'm.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. The police move was great on Matthew's part. I think that was some bullshit, and I quite enjoyed how it. Well, basically, Matthew turned with one phone call, Matthew turned the entire city of Los Angeles on its ear because the police ended up, thanks to you, and of course Blythe for like getting these police to back down without actually starting a firefight at your house. But you led them to these hunters and caused what amounts to a massive firefight inside LA, which, given that this is our timeline is in 2003, America is really sensitive to that sort of thing around this time, and especially in populous areas like LA. So you have your like by the end it must be like almost 100 people with guns on the street once the police get their reinforcements in. So basically, with one phone call, the end result is like martial law in LA, and probably the National Guard are getting called in, and basically armed police on every corner from now on.
I think ironically, given that Lucille sort of like did this accidentally, she's actually done almost the perfect Sabbat tactic for like disrupting the Camarilla hold on a city. Because obviously we're like, yeah, there's police everywhere, that's a minor inconvenience. However, if you're like some Camarilla whose like influence is now being affected on different levels by this, it's more vastly inconvenient for them than it is for us. We're like, oh, we've got to avoid police a bit. Oh, we've got to be a bit careful. That's fine. Whereas if you've suddenly got like, you're having trouble like overtly controlling your influence because the like police are poking their nose into everything, it's going to be a massive pain for the Camarilla. And ironically, given that Lucille seems like more like a Camarilla vampire almost than a Sabbat vampire, she's created like the perfect environment for the Sabbat to actually flourish in.
Yeah, plenty of violence as well, because you know that the law enforcement personnel in the city are going to look for, because there was a lot of shooters in the sort of like staging house that you got the police to fight with. There was a lot of people there, so they know that it's multiple perpetrators, so they're going to be looking for more. So you just know that it's going to be gang warfare up in this business here, because they're going to be busting down some doors that they maybe shouldn't. So there's going to be just like entirely unconnected to anything, gangs getting police attention, and it's going to turn out ugly for them as well.
I think we're probably likely to see some like a swelling in the number of Sabbat as well, because I know I've embraced a couple of people, but given that the fact there's going to be sort of like gun-toting like badasses like everywhere, I can certainly see there's going to be at least a few of the other packs we're met who are going to be like, oh, these will make potentially good Canaanites, so let's just grab a few of these people and like embrace them to like swell our numbers, which obviously is then going to sort of feedback loop into that whole sort of escalation of violence and make it worse.
Yeah, depending on how things go, this could be very bad for LA in the long run, in our timeline at least. A question for you. You played Sabbat before, I think?
Yeah, I've played in a few Sabbat games before.
Yeah. So, how would you say this game compares to those?
I would say one of the nice things about this is when I've played in previous Sabbat games, it's tended to focus more on your characters being like an established pack from the get-go. You sort of create your characters as a pack. You're in the Sabbat, you've been in there for a few years, you know all the ins and outs, boom, crack on with it. Whereas in the game you're running, we sort of, although we started off Sabbat, we weren't sort of like true Sabbat. So although we sort of fairly soon got recognised, it was nice to sort of like play through that introduction and sort of do the awkward bits when you're like, oh right, we're not really true Sabbat, like anyone can technically just off us and then have to worry about it, so we've got to tread a bit carefully. And now we're slowly starting to sort of get our Billy Big Ones on a bit more and go like, oh yeah, we're true Sabbat, we're like the collateral damage pack, we've got a few missions under our belt, we're getting a bit of a swagger on. It's nice to actually play through that lead in rather than it just be like, boom, you're a Sabbat pack, go.
Yeah, and I think that was pretty cool as well. That I think you came up with the idea first back in like before we started playing, that maybe it'd be cool to just play like real simple, like start from the beginning and like stick to the street level stuff. So maybe like not with the and this plays into like why I wanted to do this in LA as well, because LA at least in my setting that we're playing in now, because I sort of like moved the timeline forward to where the Free State is basically collapsed, and the Camarilla is sort of like picking at the carcass, installing a priest, and then the Sabbat is like, well, like, we fucked up a lot before, but maybe now we can do it. And like, just send in the scrubs, like whoever we don't like, just send them to LA. Like all the losers are there, and it was fun starting this game with the idea that we're not going to deal with super high level web of politics and old favors and whatnot, and we're going to focus on more street level, like visceral sort of like rivalries with some people who just aren't that like well established or liked anyway. Like even if they, like, some of them are like, yeah, I'm a bishop, what you gonna do, bitch? But like they're not like in favor of the sect at large. Like they can maybe declare themselves bishop in this shithole town that doesn't belong to the Sabbat yet. They can do that, but they're not like big head honchos in Mexico City or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things and I agree, I'm very much a fan of the street level stuff. One of the things I've found, sort of like the potential downside, is when you play a vampire game where you become quite powerful, in terms of either you've been playing a long time or you start off playing Ancilla or whatever, there is a tendency for the game to become almost sort of like superhero power levels. Because let's face it, if you're some like Camarilla Elder, like getting hold of like blood's not a problem. You just like Shalda or Ghouls, like bring me a person, boom, blood sorted out. So that doesn't become such a thing. You've probably you're on a level of humanity or a path that you can maintain, because obviously if you couldn't, you'd have fallen to the beast long before you became an elder or a powerful ancilla. So the sort of like the weaknesses of the vampiric form are lessened a bit, so it does become almost like a sort of superheroes with fangs game rather than a vampire game.
Yeah, I think back in the day they used to call the superhero era of vampire the Vampians. So, yeah, that's one of the things that I sort of miss with vampire in general. Like that was never the vampire that I planned. It's been somewhat of a revelation to find out that was the experience that some other people had. Like that there was this time when you basically just played superheroes with fangs that sometimes needed to top off the blood gas tank, and then you just go on.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly know that a few of the games I played in where we sort of got to quite powerful levels, they tended not to last very long after that, because once you got beyond the whole, like, oh, isn't it cool to have a cackload of disciplines, once you realise, like, you can pretty much get away with anything, and there's nothing that can really stand in your way other than, like, older vampires, there's no real challenge about anything, whereas when you're playing the sort of earlier levels, the sort of street levels, everything you do feels like a bit of a challenge. I mean, in the What Rough Beast game, okay, yeah, I think my highest discipline I've got like a couple of points in obfuscate and a couple of points in demontation, which, yeah, don't get me wrong, it's great for like enhancing people's emotions or like making myself invisible, but none of it's flawless, none of it completely erases risk. And I think when you get to the really high levels of disciplines, it's like, let's say you're a vampire with like the dreaded Celerity 5, and maybe, maybe a few dots of potence and fortitude. If some like human comes at you with a gun, you're just going to laugh at that gun, take it off, and then like twist the human up like a pretzel without even breaking a sweat. Yeah. So there's no real like risk involved once you get beyond a certain level, unless like an even more powerful vampire comes in, and you just end up with this like, escalating power scale.
Yeah, which is a game I wouldn't mind playing, right? I wouldn't mind playing a game where, well, you could set this in the Dark Ages as well, but I started immediately thinking about the sort of like multi-century game that we were talking about before. You could start in the Dark Ages, you play as a ghoul a while, then you get embraced. You play some stuff like leading up to, like, let's say present day, and like present day, you're a 600-year-old vampire, and like you can smoke every neonate in the city if you wanted to. And I would quite like actually to play a game where that's like the average player character. Like all of you are like really stompy elders, and then like your focus is entirely on those who are immediately above you in the chain. So in the Camarilla, you'd be really worried about like, whoever has authority, I think. So you'd be looking out for Justicars and princes and whatnot. Yeah. And then the actual like secret elders of the clan that you're in, and also the elders of other clans in the Camarilla. And then it becomes a game of this like paranoia, because you are really strong. You can destroy lesser vampires. Like, you know that someone is more powerful than you, and you don't know what they want. You don't know where their influence is. You don't know how to like stay out of their shadow, so that you can stay safe necessarily. And you still want more. You're not powerful. You're not the most powerful vampire. So who the fuck is above you? And then you start to like. This is the whole like meta plot thing they had, right? The children start going like, oh wait a minute, like the elders. I don't like the idea of the elders. That sounds really scary. So maybe let's band up and kill them. That might be a cool game to play at some point. But yeah, to like your point, absolutely. If that's not the game premise and you're just playing your regular like, there's a masquerade preach, like go deal with that, and you're an elder with like, I don't know, like 5 presents, and you just decide that the city doesn't care, and that happens. You just sit in your home and you go, I have 6 in presence or whatever, so the entire city feels what I decide it feels, and it feels like it doesn't care.
One of the most interesting concepts I saw for a vampire game, which a friend of mine sort of first suggested, but I've not got around to running, that I quite fancy doing in the future, was a bit of a riff on the sort of like the generational sort of chronicle. And the idea was you sort of started off in Dark Ages playing like your neonates. You then went to like your second time period, be it like Victorian age or the Renaissance or whatever, and you played your previous character sort of powered up for a few sessions, long enough for them to like choose a childer. You then played that childer, or you played each other's childer till the end of that time period. Then you sort of repeated with those childer, sort of picking their own children in like modern day, etc. And you do like a few sessions where like, so in modern day you do like a few sessions where you'd like be playing your original character, now an elder. You do a few sessions where you're playing like your second character, like the ancilla, and you do the majority of it playing like the newer sort of like neonate in the modern day. I thought that might be an interesting way to sort of still have like, you still get to play your old character as an elder, but without it just being like every session like, I'm an elder, I got them disciplines, boy, what are you going to do about it?
That'd be cool. And you get into like, you don't even need, as the person running the game, you don't really need much of a plot at that point. At least if your players are comfortable with like playing each other's children along this great chain of vampires, and then doing the whole vampire thing, which is you jockey for power and you look for ways to basically take over the positions of your elders. So I think if you create this chain of vampires, you could just have a game of intrigue just within those lines, like people trying to take over each other's stuff and to basically kill each other.
I think I was quite lucky that sort of when I was getting into Vampire, I played a lot of like Mind's Eye Theatre, like the sort of live action version of Vampire the Masquerade, because whereas like traditional Vampire the Masquerade, you tend to be in like a coterie or a pack or whatever, and you're sort of working with a pack. Mind's Eye Theatre is much more like you are a vampire and you're trying to sort of scrabble over the bodies of everyone else to like get to these positions of power. So I think in a way it sort of prepares you better for those games of intrigue almost than like a traditional tabletop game of Vampire.
Yeah, I've been listening to, they do a couple of podcasts. They're called like the Utility Muffin Lab. They do this really great podcast called 25 Years of Vampire the Masquerade, like a retrospective, where they review each Vampire the Masquerade book that's been released, and they talk about that. So I've been listening to a lot of those episodes. Great stuff. Have you
got links you'd be able to send me for those? So I can put them in the description of the podcast in case anyone's interested.
Oh yeah,
cool.
Yeah. So Utility Muffin Labs, they do the retrospective podcast, and then like a more general like stuff that's on our mind. Usually it's vampire as well, but the other stuff as well. And apparently these guys are really like experienced LARPers, so they probably have done, at least that's the impression I get, that they have done at least as much LARP as they have done the tabletop vampire. Yeah. So and this is I haven't done LARP ever in any game, so this is all very interesting to me in that sort of way as well, because I don't have experience of my own. But I was just listening to them today, and they were talking about like going into this LARP event, one of them. And it was, I think, One World by Darkness or something. And it's sort of like a shared connected world, which includes these different events in different areas of the actual world. And it's apparently a very long-running game. And the other host of the podcast had been there, and he was like, well, I heard like someone discussing event that had been going on in like 2011 in game, and then the point of that discussion was like, if you hear someone talk about stuff that happened in 2011 in game time, you know that they're probably a badass by now. Yeah. They're gonna have some points on their sheets. So yeah, I imagine like if you have long form LARPs like that, and obviously like you will have if you've thought about this stuff, you will probably have some sort of like system for new people to join in and not just feel like useless compared to everyone who's been playing for like 15 years. But I imagine like coming into LARP like that must be intimidating as all hell when you realize that oh shit, these people have been at this forever, and this is my first LARP.
Well, I know there was I went to a couple of LARPs, Mind's Eye Theatre LARPs, with friends of mine that happened in Milton Keynes over here, and they've been running like for I think probably like 5 to 8 years. And I gen like a brouhaha. I was like the child of like one of my friends, and turned up, and on the first evening you turn up and you're like, all right, this is the prince. You're like his grandchild, or like twice removed, and you're like, okay. And a lot of these sort of like the Mind's Eye games I played were fairly sort of small, because obviously I live in a small town, so you're talking like 10, 15 people max. Then you go to like a game in a big city like Milton Keynes, and they're like, oh, we regularly get like 50 people like turning up to like this LARP, and you're just like, wow, shit. And like you think half of them have probably been playing it like since the early days. And like you say, it's an entirely different experience. But talking of sort of long running games, I know that when you started What Rough Beast, you were saying that you had a sort of like a finite sort of run for the game in mind. Is there any particular reason you wanted to sort of like keep it a finite game rather than like an open-ended game?
I guess I wanted to have, for once, I wanted to have some sort of contained, like I wanted a definite endpoint. I didn't necessarily know like how many game sessions we would have or what the definite endpoint would be, but I wanted a definite end game in this sort of continuum that we have going on, because my games tend to be like it's the curse of running campaigns, right? You get a lot of games that just peter out, and while that's good in the way that, well, obviously unless that happens in like the third session, you play quite a lot of game sessions per campaign, and usually the thing peters out when the fuel runs out of your game, and like that's still good. You've got to play a lot of games. At least that's the way it goes for me. I usually get to play, let's say, like 15, 20 sessions at least per campaign, and that's a good amount of gaming. And I'm happy with that sort of thing. But I just wanted something different. Like I didn't want to go for the sort of like sandbox thing where, even though that's like we've been doing some of the freeform stuff, like I haven't forced stuff down your throats that much. Even though I keep pestering you with some of these NPCs who want you to do stuff. But given the situation, like no one is forcing you, at least not at the moment, to do any of that. Like they just they're asking you to do stuff, and then you decide what you do. But I wanted to avoid doing the thing where I have you guys make characters. I have you guys make connections between the characters and the setting, and then there's the wide world, and you can do whatever you want. That's fun, and I do that a lot. And it leads into some interesting things when you have players who like to pursue their own goals, and that's usually the way it goes anyway. So that's the sort of campaigns that I tend to be involved in. But I wanted to try something different. I wanted to, first and foremost, I wanted to tell myself, like, you're not going to just run this forever. You're going to end this at some point. And I've sort of, from the beginning, I've had some stuff in mind, which I imagined as sort of the beginning of the end for this particular story arc and these particular characters. And I haven't like planned out the definite end of this game, but I know that there is a finish line somewhere, and I'm just waiting for you guys to reach it, I guess. In like, if you know at all what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think for myself, from a sort of GMing point of view as well, I mean, one of the reasons I tend to favour also games that are sort of contained in a bit sort of like a finite plot arc is I've always got ideas for like future games I want to run, and obviously we've all got only so much time we can actually spend prepping for games. So I think if you've got the one game that just sort of like runs forever and a day, you never really get to like try out some of these other games. I mean, it's like the Dungeon World game I ran for people that had a finite end plan, like yourself, not sort of finite. Yes, we're going to play 10 sessions and that will be it. But more a case like when you reach this point, that will be the end. And it's like, well, if that game had carried on forever, I wouldn't have got to run like the Rose of Westhaven. We wouldn't have freed up the time for like you to run what Rough Beast in. So I'd have been sort of like locked into that one game. Whereas I think once you get beyond a certain point, it's nice to like wrap things off and tie them up and then say, all right, let's go on and try something different now for like a change of pace.
Yeah. And also, well, just like I said, there's so many games I want to play, and at some point I just feel like I maybe need to just limit the length of some of these games that I get involved in, just to get more games in, like different types of games, try different flavors, experiment with stuff, and do like weird stuff as well. And also, there's so many more vampire games I want to run. So this isn't the only vampire story I want to play. So there's that as well. Like, I enjoy a lot of different aspects of vampire, and while this is great fun to have this sort of down and dirty LA story that now just exploded with the last session.
Literally.
Yeah. It's really fun to do that. But I also have countless concepts and like story flashpoints for different kinds of vampire games in the Dark Ages, in the present day, in the future as well. And of course, with V5 coming out, I really want to play some of that as well. So, like you said, there's only so much time, and the curse of being a person who enjoys a lot of different games, that's something I find that I need to really keep in mind, because I can't get everything on my plate at once.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I've got a friend of mine who sort of like lives nearby, and he's been trying to set up like a one-shot sort of face-to-face like Fate game using like Dresden Files Accelerated. Yeah. And he keeps sort of like put on Facebook, he's like, all right, okay, how about this date? And like, if it's like within like a week or so, I'm like, dude, like my weekend's booked up. I've pretty much always got games on Sunday evening. I'm quite often playing D&D like in the wee small hours of Saturday morning. Plus, like, when you factor in like tremulous one shots and bits and pieces like that, it's a lot harder, I find now, to sort of at short notice just go, all right, boom, I'm going to run a game. It's like, occasionally it happens. Like I was talking about the recent sort of Lamentations game I played in Christensen run. That was just a case of I saw his post on Facebook. I happened to be free, and I was like, right, do you need any more players? Like, boom, let's go. But it's like so much rarer now that actually happens.
Yeah, I've been really overjoyed by the fact that we actually could fit in 3 Tremulous games in a fairly short amount of time, and in rapid succession as well. So that was a nice break from like the usual stuff that we do.
Yeah, it's been nice. It was nice to play the 3 games in fairly quick succession as well, because they're all quite different, even though they were Tremulous games using sort of like similar play sets and characters, playbooks. So it was nice to sort of play them together, so you can more easily like contrast the differences between the different games and sort of say, oh yeah, you can see like there was a difference when we were playing this journey as to when we were going to Ebon Eves, as to when this was happening. And it was nice to get that bit of contrast, whereas I think, like I say, another one of the curses of playing like quite a lot of games is you tend to only remember like the standout moments in games after a bit.
Yeah, that happens. And well, I guess that's just the nature of playing a lot. Like, eventually you won't be able to keep up with all the stuff. But then I guess you could look at it as being somewhat compensated, at least, by the fact that if you play more games, you're probably going to get more of those high points as well, and different kinds of high points as well.
That's, I mean, much as I sort of like bitch about not having enough time like an old man, but it's a good problem to have, going like, oh, I'm struggling to fit games in, rather than just being like, oh, I can't find any games to join in with, or I can't get anyone to play games or whatever. I'd far rather have the problem of going like, oh, I'm struggling to find free time.
Yeah, so because like, I already have so many games on the calendar.
That's it, rather than being like, oh, I'm playing no games at the minute and I'm struggling to find one. I'd far rather have the too many games problem. So, okay, to round off this podcast episode, a couple more questions. From what you know now, what do you envision the eventual fate of the collateral damage pack being in your game? What's your prediction?
I think, like, there's actually, like, despite the WOD, I think Fracture is definitely on the cards there, because there's a lot of like internal, like, structural stress in the pack, because you're all kind of pulling a different direction. So I think definitely, I think maybe if one of you dies, it's just probably gonna be the other two are just gonna like hightail it out. I think that's definitely on the cards. And death is definitely on the cards now, because you guys kicked the hornet's nest. So I think maybe like disbanding is the most likely. And then of course, like, if you really mess up, there's definitely you're going to like mess with the Archbishop shit probably in the next session. So that's a bad idea. So there's definitely a chance for just a throwdown between like a good old Sabbat, like, punch out.
And my final question, what has been the most surprising or entertaining moment in the game thus far for yourself?
I think it was probably there's two moments, right, that really stand out, like who said, like the high point, and they were in the same session. I think, if I remember correctly, it was in the ESMA. First off, when Matthew walks in, and I make use of his flaw of being mistaken for someone else to cause everyone to think that it was an actual Archbishop that just walked in, where it was actually Matthew's nobody, barely, not even true Sabbat character that walked in. So that was very entertaining. And basically, from that, when I did that, I don't think I talked for like 45 minutes, because you guys were busy discussing what to do with the situation. So that was great. And then the second standout part was when we had the Diablerie of the Camarilla Nosferatu by your character, and how that changed not just your character, but like a lot of what happened afterwards. Because of course that's the point where your character diverged really hard from being their regular selves, but dead and trying to figure out what vampirism is, and like straight up into hardcore Sabbat. And the Diablerie was a very, very memorable, like, turning point for the entire game for me, I think.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting how, like you say, it didn't only affect my own character, but like the relationships between the different characters, and how like you say, how the sort of the fractures started showing amongst the pack structure. I think that was really cool.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for talking to me, Johannes, about your What Rough Beast V20 Sabbat game. Now, just to close off, if there was anyone out there who was thinking, I'm thinking about running a V20 game, they maybe not run it before, what sort of like few piece of advice would you give them if they're thinking of starting up a V20 game?
Don't sweat the details, whether that's the in-game world, the sort of metaplot, as it's called, and use the bits that you need and entertain you, because there's a lot of material in there. And if you're doing this the first time, it's a lot to take in, and you don't need to. That's the key to understanding V20, I think, and how to get an enjoyable experience. Use the bits that appeal to you and entertain you. That's probably like that. If I need to like put it simply, that's how you do it.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us in this episode, Johannes, and we will wrap up here. So that's it for this episode. If you have any questions or suggestions for things you'd like to see in the podcast in future, please either email them to reddicediaries@gmail.com or drop me a voicemail at Anchor. Until I see you next time, wherever you're playing, take care and enjoy yourselves.